I decided to spend the weekend in an isolated cabin deep in the woods, hoping for a break from my hectic life. The cabin was a simple, wooden structure surrounded by towering trees. I arrived just before sunset, and after unpacking, I felt a wave of calm wash over me. I made a small fire outside and enjoyed the fresh air and the sounds of nature. As darkness fell, the forest changed. The cheerful chirping of birds faded, replaced by eerie silence. I felt the cool breeze on my skin, and a shiver ran down my spine. I tried to shake off the feeling and focused on the fire. After a while, I decided to head inside. I locked the door and settled onto the couch with a book. The warmth of the fire was comforting, and I lost myself in the story, but the quiet soon became unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every little noise made me jump. I told myself it was just my imagination. As I read, I suddenly heard a loud crack from outside. I froze, my heart racing. It sounded like something heavy had fallen nearby. I put my book down and listened intently. There was nothing but silence again, but the tension in the air was thick. I convinced myself it was probably just a branch falling. I tried to return to my book, but my mind kept wandering back to the sound. I set the book aside and grabbed a flashlight. I needed to check outside to reassure myself that everything was fine. I opened the door carefully, shining the light into the darkness. The beam cut through the night, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. I stepped outside, feeling the cool air against my face. The forest was still, but I sensed something was off. I scanned the area, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I was about to turn back, I caught a glimpse of movement near the edge of the trees. I squinted, trying to see better. There it was again, a dark shape shifting among the branches. My instincts told me to retreat, but I felt compelled to investigate. I slowly walked toward the trees, my flashlight beam flickering across the ground. The darkness felt alive, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. Suddenly, I stumbled over a root and fell to the ground. The flashlight slipped from my hand and went out. Panic gripped me as I scrambled to get up, my breath coming in quick gasps. I fumbled for the flashlight, and when I found it, I switched it back on. The light flickered for a moment before shining brightly again. But when I looked up, the dark shape was gone. I stood there, trying to calm myself, but every rustle of leaves made me jump. I knew I needed to get back inside. I hurried toward the cabin, the feeling of being watched creeping back over me. Once inside, I locked the door again and sat on the couch, heart racing. The fire had died down, leaving only glowing embers. I decided to stay awake, listening for any more sounds. Hours passed, and I finally began to relax. Just as I thought I could drift off to sleep, I heard a noise, louder this time, like something heavy was moving around outside. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. My thoughts raced as I tried to decide what to do. Should I call for help? Would anyone even hear me? I felt trapped, alone in the middle of nowhere. Gathering my courage, I crept to the window. I slowly pulled the curtain aside and peeked out. My breath caught in my throat. There, in the dim light, I saw a large figure moving close to the cabin. It was too dark to see clearly, but it was big. Much bigger than a deer or any animal I knew. I stepped back from the window, panic surging again. I needed to defend myself. I searched the cabin and found a heavy wooden chair. I placed it against the door, feeling more secure with something blocking my way. I returned to the window, peeking out again. The figure was still there, lurking just outside. Then it moved closer, and I could finally see what it was. A huge, shaggy dog, clearly lost and frightened. Relief flooded over me. It seemed to sense my presence and stopped, staring back at me with sad eyes. I felt a wave of guilt wash over my fear. The dog must have been abandoned or separated from its owner. I opened the door slowly, the chair still blocking it but leaving enough space for the dog to enter. It hesitated at first, sniffing the air, then cautiously stepped inside. I knelt down, my fear fading as the dog approached me. I found a blanket and some leftover food in the cabin and offered it to the dog. It ate hungrily, tail wagging slightly. I realized I had found a companion in my moment of fear, a friend in the quiet wilderness. That night, I felt safe with the dog by my side. Together, we shared the cabin, and the forest no longer felt so lonely. When morning came, I had a new sense of purpose. I decided to search for the dog's owner when I returned to the city. It was a scary night, but it ended with a new friendship and a feeling of hope. I was excited about my weekend trip to the cabin. It was a small place my family used to visit when I was a kid. Now, as an adult, I needed a break from my busy life. I packed my bags and set off, eager for some peace in the woods. The cabin was just as I remembered, rustic and a bit worn down, surrounded by tall trees and a peaceful lake. I unloaded my car and settled in, feeling the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. I lit a fire in the fireplace, the crackling sound comforting against the backdrop of the quiet woods. As night fell, I sat on the porch, sipping coffee and watching the stars appear in the sky. Everything felt perfect. But as I turned in for the night, an unsettling feeling washed over me. The darkness outside felt thicker, and the sounds of the forest seemed louder. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. I climbed into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind raced with thoughts of the past. I remembered camping trips as a child and the stories my parents told about the woods. I told myself those stories were just that, stories, but a small part of me felt anxious, as if something was out there. Around midnight, I heard a noise. It was faint, like something scratching against the side of the cabin. My heart raced. I strained to listen, but the noise stopped. I waited, trying to calm myself, but my imagination started to run wild. What if it was a bear, or maybe someone trying to get in? I decided I needed to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, shining the light outside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing unusual. Just trees and shadows swaying in the wind. I felt a bit foolish, but the unease remained. After a few moments, I turned away from the window, but then I heard it again, this time louder and closer. It sounded like it was right outside the door. I froze, clutching the flashlight tightly. The scratching turned into a soft thud, and my pulse quickened. I knew I had to do something. I moved slowly to the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I held my breath, trying to listen. The thuds continued, but there was a strange rhythm to them. I peered through the peephole, but all I could see was darkness. With trembling hands, I opened the door a crack and shined my flashlight outside. I gasped when I saw what was making the noise. A large animal was at the bottom of the steps, pawing at the ground. It looked like a bear, but something felt off. Its fur was matted and dirty, and it seemed to be struggling. Without thinking, I stepped outside, the light guiding my way. The bear looked up at me, and I felt a mix of fear and sympathy. It was clear it wasn't here to attack. Instead, it seemed lost and scared, like it needed help. I backed away slowly, not wanting to provoke it. I remembered my food supplies inside. I thought if I could offer it something to eat, maybe it would go away peacefully. I rushed back into the cabin and grabbed some leftover food I had. I carefully placed it on the porch, then retreated inside. Peeking through the window, I watched as the bear cautiously approached the food, sniffed around, then began to eat. I felt relieved. It was just hungry, not a threat. I continued to watch, feeling a strange connection to this creature. It was just trying to survive, just like I was. After a few moments, the bear finished eating and turned away from the cabin, disappearing back into the woods. I stood there, feeling the adrenaline fade away. I was amazed that I had faced my fear and that the encounter had ended without violence. As dawn broke, the sun filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow around the cabin. I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The night had been terrifying, but it had also reminded me of the beauty and unpredictability of nature. I smiled, knowing I had survived the night and learned something valuable. With a new appreciation for the woods, I took a deep breath, ready to enjoy the rest of my weekend. I stepped outside to greet the morning, feeling grateful for the experience and the quiet peace that now surrounded me. The cabin was a safe haven once again, and I knew I would carry this memory with me for a long time. I had been looking forward to my weekend getaway for weeks. After a hectic few months at work, I needed some peace and quiet. I found a cozy cabin deep in the woods, away from the noise of the city. It was the perfect spot to relax, or so I thought. When I arrived, the cabin was just as I imagined. Rustic and charming, with wooden beams and a small porch that overlooked a lake. The air smelled fresh, filled with the scent of pine trees. I unpacked my bags and settled in, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. As night fell, I lit a fire in the fireplace and made a simple dinner. After eating, I curled up on the couch with a book, the warm glow of the fire making the cabin feel inviting. But as darkness enveloped the woods outside, a strange feeling crept in. The forest seemed to come alive with sounds, the wind rustling the leaves, branches creaking, and the distant hooting of an owl. I tried to focus on my book, but my mind kept wandering. Then I heard a noise outside. At first, I dismissed it as an animal, but it sounded too close. It was a series of soft thuds, like something or someone was moving near the cabin. My heart began to race. I told myself it was nothing. I was alone in the woods. It was just my imagination running wild. I forced myself to ignore it and return to my book, but the noise continued. It grew louder, more persistent. I decided to check the windows, shining my flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees swaying gently in the wind. I felt foolish for worrying about nothing. A few hours passed and I went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every little sound pulled me back to wakefulness. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a loud bang against the cabin wall. I jolted upright, my heart racing. The sound echoed in my ears. I lay there, frozen, listening intently. I picked up my phone to check the time, almost midnight. I was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I grabbed my flashlight and crept out of bed, clutching it tightly in one hand. I didn't want to believe it, but fear gripped me as I walked toward the front door. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped onto the porch. The cool night air hit my face. I scanned the area with my flashlight, shining it toward the tree line. Nothing seemed out of place, but then I noticed something glimmering in the light, just beyond the reach of the beam. My heart dropped as I realized it was a pair of eyes staring back at me. I quickly turned the flashlight toward the eyes, and they vanished into the shadows. I felt a chill run down my spine. I backed up, heart pounding, and rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. I had to calm down. It was probably just a deer or a raccoon. But then the banging resumed, louder this time. I felt trapped, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I grabbed the frying pan from the kitchen, feeling ridiculous, but I needed something for protection. I returned to the living room, keeping my eyes on the door. The noise continued, and I could feel my heart racing. Then, everything went silent. I stood there, gripping the pan tightly, waiting for the next sound. Minutes felt like hours. Suddenly, There was a soft whimper outside. Couldn't believe my ears. Curiosity got the better of me. I slowly opened the door a crack, peering into the darkness. The whimpering grew louder, and I realized it was coming from just outside the porch. I shone the flashlight and gasped. A small dog, muddy and shivering, was sitting at the foot of the steps, looking up at me with pleading eyes. Relief washed over me. I quickly stepped outside and knelt down, extending my hand. The dog approached cautiously, sniffing my fingers. I felt an overwhelming wave of compassion. It must have been lost, wandering through the woods all alone. I had been so terrified moments ago, but now I felt a sense of purpose. I brought the dog inside, offering it some water and a bit of food I had. It lapped up the water eagerly and devoured the food. As it settled next to me, I felt warmth spreading in my chest. The fear from before faded away. As dawn broke, the first rays of light filled the cabin, and I smiled at my new friend curled up beside me. I realized I had not only found a companion, but also a sense of safety in the fear I had felt. The weekend that had started with dread now felt full of hope. I was no longer alone in the woods. Together, we would face whatever came our way. I had been looking forward to a weekend getaway for months. I rented a small cabin deep in the woods, hoping for a break from the chaos of everyday life. The drive was beautiful, with tall trees lining the winding road and sunlight filtering through the leaves. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked just as it had in the pictures. Cozy and inviting, with a wooden porch and a small fire pit out back. After unpacking, I stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled of pine. I lit a fire in the fireplace and settled into a comfy chair with a book. As night fell, the flickering flames cast long shadows across the room. I felt relaxed, almost sleepy, as the crackling fire lulled me into a sense of security. But as I read, I began to hear noises outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the leaves, but then I heard something else. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on the forest floor. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was probably just a deer or another animal, but the sound kept coming, growing closer and louder. I tried to ignore it and focused on my book, but my nerves were on edge. Every time the wind blew, I jumped. Finally, I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam into the dark. The night was still and quiet, but my heart raced. I felt exposed, standing there alone in the cold. I walked around the cabin, looking for any signs of movement. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing only trees and shadows. I felt a little foolish. Maybe it really was just an animal. I turned to go back inside, but then I heard it again, a loud snap, like a twig breaking. It was behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I was about to head back when I saw something moving near the edge of the trees. It was quick, disappearing before I could get a good look. Panic surged through me. I backed away toward the cabin, my instincts screaming to go inside. I locked the door behind me and sat on the couch, feeling the heat of the fire on my face. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast. The sounds outside returned, rustling, snapping, and a low growl that sent chills down my spine. Time passed slowly, each minute feeling like an hour. I considered calling someone for help, but my phone had no signal. I was completely alone. The growling continued, sometimes getting closer, and then fading away. I felt trapped, my mind racing with terrifying possibilities. Finally, I decided I couldn't stay cooped up any longer. I needed to find out what was out there, even if it scared me. I grabbed my flashlight and the heavy fire poker, feeling slightly more secure. I opened the door and stepped outside again, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, I moved carefully toward the sound, shining my flashlight into the trees. I could see shadows dancing in the beam of light, but nothing moved. I felt a mixture of fear and determination. I wouldn't let whatever was out there control my night. Then, I saw it again, a flash of movement. I directed my light to where it had been and found myself staring at a large animal. It wasn't a bear or anything dangerous. It was a wolf, lean and hungry, watching me from a distance. I froze, holding my breath. It was just as scared of me as I was of it. I realized that the wolf was likely hungry and lost, just like I felt. In that moment, I didn't see a threat. I saw a creature struggling to survive. I took a step back, slowly, and the wolf remained still, observing me. I knew I had to get back inside, but I felt a strange sense of connection with this wild animal. I retreated to the cabin, closing the door quietly behind me. I sat by the fire again, my heart still racing, but now I felt a strange calm wash over me. I knew the wolf was out there, but I also knew it meant me no harm. I realized I wasn't truly alone in the woods. There were living beings all around me, sharing this space. The rest of the night passed without incident. I heard the wolf moving around outside for a while, but eventually, it grew quiet. When morning came, I opened the door to find the world bathed in soft light. The forest looked different, more alive, and less threatening. I decided to leave the cabin, not out of fear, but with a sense of gratitude for the experience. I packed my things, ready to return to my normal life, but I felt changed. I had faced my fears and learned that sometimes, the things that scare us can also bring us unexpected understanding and connection. I needed a break from everything, so I rented a small cabin in the woods for the weekend. It was isolated, surrounded by tall trees, and that's exactly what I wanted. I drove for hours, leaving the city behind, feeling more relaxed with each mile. When I finally arrived, I was pleased to see that the cabin looked just like the pictures. It was charming, with wooden walls and a little porch. Once inside, I unpacked my things and settled in. The sun was shining, and I felt happy as I made myself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch to enjoy the view. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and chirping birds. It was peaceful, but as the sun began to set, I felt a slight chill in the air. I decided to go for a short walk to explore the area. I wandered through the woods, admiring the trees and the soft ground beneath my feet. The sunlight filtered through the branches, creating beautiful patterns on the ground. After a while, I turned back, feeling content. That evening, I lit a fire in the cabin's fireplace, its warmth making the place feel cozy. I made dinner and settled down with a book. But as darkness enveloped the cabin, I began to feel uneasy. The crackling of the fire was comforting, but outside, the forest felt alive with sounds I couldn't identify. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just animals moving around. As I read, I heard a loud thump against the cabin wall. I froze, my heart racing. It sounded like something heavy had hit the outside of the cabin. I set the book down and listened intently. The sounds of the forest faded, leaving only my pounding heart. I got up and moved to the window, shining my flashlight outside, but there was nothing to see. I went back to the couch, trying to focus on my book, but the unease wouldn't leave me. The thumping came again, this time followed by a soft scraping sound. It felt like something was moving around the cabin. I stood up, clutching the flashlight, my mind racing with possibilities. I decided to check the door and make sure it was locked. I walked to the front door and pulled on the handle. It was secure. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. It was just my imagination, I told myself. I returned to the couch and turned off the lights, relying on the fire's glow. But then I heard it again. This time it was a series of knocks, rhythmic and steady. I grabbed the frying pan from the kitchen, holding it tightly as I crept toward the door. The sounds continued, and I felt a rush of fear. I peeked through the peephole but saw nothing. With shaking hands, I opened the door a crack. The night air was cold, and I scanned the porch with my flashlight. Still nothing. I stepped outside, my heart racing. I took a few cautious steps, shining the light around, but the forest was still. Suddenly, I heard a rustling behind me. I turned quickly, shining the light towards the sound. There, emerging from the shadows, was a large animal. My heart dropped as I realized it was a deer, caught in the moonlight. Stood still, looking at me with big eyes. I felt a mix of relief and embarrassment. As the deer moved away, I returned to the cabin, closing the door behind me. I sat back down, feeling foolish for being so scared. I tried to shake it off, but as I prepared for bed, I heard a noise again. This time, it sounded like something heavy dragging across the ground outside. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal. I looked around for anything else I could use. I felt trapped and anxious. I went to the window again, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was out there. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and I saw movement again. My breath caught in my throat. It was the deer again, but it wasn't alone. There were several of them, gathered close to the cabin, their eyes reflecting the light like tiny mirrors. I watched in awe as they milled around, snorting softly and occasionally bumping against the walls. They were harmless, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling of being watched. After a while, they wandered off into the trees, leaving me alone again. I finally relaxed, realizing that the only danger was my own fear. I crawled into bed, feeling grateful for the unexpected visitors. I had let my imagination run wild, thinking of worst-case scenarios when all I needed to do was appreciate the moment. As the night passed, I slept soundly, knowing that sometimes what we fear isn't as scary as it seems. When morning came, the sun lit up the cabin, and I smiled, feeling refreshed. I had faced my fear and found a sense of calm in the quiet of the woods. It wasn't just a weekend away. It was a chance to reconnect with nature and myself. I needed a break from my hectic life, so I decided to spend the weekend at a cabin deep in the woods. I rented a small place that looked cozy in the photos. The moment I arrived, I felt a rush of excitement mixed with a hint of nervousness. It was just me, nature, and the peaceful silence of the forest. The cabin was simple but charming, with a wooden porch and a fireplace. After unpacking, I explored the area. The tall trees surrounded me like silent guardians, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and chirping birds. I felt free and at ease as I walked along the dirt path, breathing in the fresh air. As night fell, I lit a fire in the fireplace and settled onto the couch with a book. The crackling of the fire was comforting, and I began to forget about the busy world I had left behind. But soon the serenity shifted. I started hearing noises outside, the sound of branches snapping and leaves crunching. It made my heart race. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was probably just an animal. After all, I was in the woods. I continued reading, but my mind wandered. The noises became more distinct. I couldn't focus. I stood up and walked to the window, peering into the darkness. My flashlight barely cut through the thick blackness outside. I saw nothing. As I returned to the couch, the sounds outside grew louder. It sounded like footsteps. I felt a chill run down my spine. I reminded myself it was just my imagination, but that didn't help much. The cabin felt smaller and more isolated. I glanced at the door, half expecting someone to come barging in. I decided to distract myself with a snack, hoping the noises would fade away. I rummaged through my bag, but the rustling outside grew closer, and my stomach twisted with anxiety. I grabbed my phone to check for a signal, but it showed nothing. I felt trapped, alone, and a little foolish for coming here by myself. I took a deep breath and forced myself to be calm. I reminded myself that I was safe inside the cabin. But then, a loud bang echoed against the cabin wall. I jumped, my heart racing. I quickly grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and held it tightly. I moved toward the front door, every sound amplified in my ears. I opened the door slightly, shining the light outside. The beam illuminated the porch but revealed nothing unusual. I stood frozen for a moment, listening. The sounds had stopped. I felt ridiculous for being scared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The darkness felt heavy around me, and the trees loomed like shadows. I shone the flashlight around the area, revealing nothing but the quiet woods. Just as I was about to head back inside, I noticed something moving in the bushes. I held my breath, pointing the flashlight in that direction. My heart raced as I saw a pair of eyes staring back at me. I felt a surge of fear but kept my light steady. Slowly, a small deer stepped out from the underbrush, its ears twitching as it sensed my presence. It seemed just as startled as I was. Couldn't help but feel relieved. I had been so afraid, imagining all sorts of terrible things. But here was just a deer, a reminder of the beauty of the forest. I smiled, realizing how quickly I had let my imagination take over. The deer took a cautious step back into the bushes, and I stood still, watching it disappear into the night. As I went back inside, I felt lighter. I locked the door and took a moment to breathe. I decided to turn on some music to break the silence. As the familiar tunes filled the cabin, I sank into the couch, feeling safe once again. The fear I had felt earlier was replaced with a sense of calm. That night, I slept soundly, listening to the gentle sounds of the forest around me. I woke up the next morning to sunlight streaming through the windows. The world outside looked different, filled with life and beauty. I felt grateful for the experience, realizing that sometimes fear is just a part of being in a new place. I packed my things and prepared to leave, looking forward to sharing my adventure with friends. The cabin had taught me something important about facing my fears. It was just me and nature, and in the end, it turned out to be a weekend I would always remember. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A weekend alone in a remote cabin seemed like the perfect escape from the hustle of everyday life. I drove for hours, the roads getting narrower and the trees growing denser as I approached the cabin. When I finally arrived, it was just as beautiful as the pictures. A small, wooden structure surrounded by tall pines. After unpacking, I set about exploring the area. The woods were quiet except for the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. I felt a sense of peace wash over me as I wandered around, taking in the beauty of nature. The air was fresh, and I could hear birds singing in the distance. Everything felt perfect. As evening fell, I built a fire in the fireplace and cooked a simple meal. The flickering light of the flames cast shadows on the walls, creating a cozy atmosphere. After dinner, I sat on the porch, sipping a cup of tea while watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky turned dark quickly, and I felt a chill in the air. With darkness came silence. The usual sounds of the forest faded, leaving an unsettling quiet. I returned inside and locked the door, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping in. I curled up on the couch with a book, hoping to distract myself. But my eyes kept drifting to the window. As the night deepened, I heard a strange noise outside, a soft rustling, followed by a low growl. I froze, my heart racing. Was it just an animal? I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the noise continued, growing louder and closer. I set the book aside and crept to the window, shining my flashlight outside. The beam of light swept across the porch and into the woods, but I saw nothing. I felt foolish for being scared, so I went back to the couch, but the noises only got worse. I could hear branches snapping and something moving just out of sight. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Then, suddenly, there was a loud thud against the cabin wall. I jumped, adrenaline coursing through my veins. It was too loud to ignore. My instincts screamed at me to grab something for protection. I rushed to the kitchen and found a heavy knife. Holding it tightly, I returned to the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. The thudding continued, and I felt trapped. I couldn't ignore the noise anymore. I made my way to the door, my hands shaking. I took a deep breath and opened it slightly, peering into the darkness. Nothing, just the empty porch and the forest beyond. I felt silly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I stepped outside, gripping the knife tightly. The air was cold, and the darkness felt alive, pressing in on me. I listened carefully, and after a moment, I heard the sound again, this time closer. It was a low, menacing growl that made my skin crawl. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run back inside, but something darted past me in the shadows. I stumbled back, heart racing. I spun around, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. The flashlight beam danced wildly, illuminating trees and the porch but revealing nothing. I stood frozen, listening as the growl came again, closer this time. My mind raced, and I realized I needed to get inside. I rushed for the door, adrenaline pushing me forward. Just as I reached it, I felt something brush against my leg. I looked down to see a large dog, dirty and thin, looking up at me with fearful eyes. Relief flooded over me. I had been terrified of a wild animal, but here was this poor creature, likely lost and hungry. I knelt down, the knife forgotten in my hand. The dog backed away slightly, but I slowly extended my hand, hoping it would trust me. It sniffed my fingers, then stepped closer. I quickly grabbed some food I had in my bag and offered it to the dog. It ate hungrily, and I felt a wave of warmth wash over me. What I thought was danger had turned out to be a companion in need. I led the dog inside, and it curled up beside the fire, finally at ease. As I sat down, I realized how quickly fear can turn into relief. The night had been frightening, but now I had someone to share the cabin with. With the dog by my side, I felt safe again. I settled in for the night, the shadows no longer threatening but comforting. I had come to the cabin seeking solitude, but I found a new friend instead. Together, we would face whatever the woods had to offer. I had always dreamed of spending a weekend in a cabin deep in the woods. When I finally found a small, rustic place for rent, I couldn't resist. It was surrounded by tall trees and had a clear lake nearby, perfect for a little escape from everyday life. I packed my bags, excited for the adventure. When I arrived, the cabin looked just like the pictures. It was cozy with wooden walls and a big porch. I unloaded my things and settled in. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of pine and earth. I felt at peace. After exploring the area around the cabin, I decided to go for a hike. I marked the time on my watch and grabbed some water, eager to see what lay beyond the trees. The trail was well-worn and easy to follow. I walked for a while, enjoying the sounds of nature. The birds chirped, and a light breeze rustled the leaves. But after an hour, the path began to narrow, and the trees closed in around me. I realized I had wandered off the main trail, but it felt fine. I was confident I could find my way back. As I continued deeper into the woods, I noticed that the sounds changed. The cheerful bird song faded, and an eerie silence settled around me. I shivered slightly, dismissing it as a chill in the air. I turned back to retrace my steps, but everything looked different. The trees seemed taller, and the path I had taken was no longer visible. I started to walk faster, my heart racing. I called out to myself to stay calm, but the unease grew. I checked my watch, realizing I had been gone longer than I thought. The sunlight was beginning to fade, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I knew I had to get back to the cabin before it got too dark. Panic set in as I wandered through the underbrush. I tried to remember the way I came, but every direction looked the same. The shadows began to stretch, creating dark shapes that played tricks on my eyes. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my breath quickening with every step. The feeling of being watched crept in, but I pushed it aside. After what felt like hours, I finally found a clearing. I took a deep breath, hoping to see the cabin or at least a familiar landmark. Instead, I noticed something strange. A small, abandoned campsite lay ahead. It was overgrown with weeds, and the fire pit was cold and empty. I approached cautiously, my instincts screaming that I should turn back. As I inspected the campsite, I found old camping gear scattered around. Broken chairs, a rusted pot, and a weathered backpack. I opened the backpack, hoping to find something useful, but it was empty except for a crumpled map. It looked ancient and torn, but I could make out some of the trails. One of them seemed to lead back toward the cabin, so I decided to follow it. I clutched the map tightly as I made my way through the trees. The sun was almost down now, and I could barely see. The darkness closed in around me, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I quickened my pace, but the shadows seemed to twist and shift as I moved. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, rustling leaves and snapping twigs. My heart dropped, and I turned around, shining my flashlight in that direction. The beam revealed nothing but trees and darkness. I swallowed hard, convincing myself it was just an animal. But the feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. I pushed forward, the map clutched in my hands. Just as I began to lose hope, I saw a faint light through the trees. My heart raced with relief, and I hurried toward it. I stumbled out of the woods and found myself at the edge of the lake, the cabin just a short distance away. The porch light was on, a beacon guiding me home. I sprinted toward the cabin, tears of relief filling my eyes. Once inside, I locked the door and leaned against it, gasping for breath. The comfort of the walls wrapped around me, and I finally felt safe. I realized that my adventure could have ended badly, but I had found my way back just in time. As I sat on the couch, looking out at the calm lake, I felt grateful. The experience taught me the importance of staying aware of my surroundings. I made a promise to myself to be more careful in the future. With the cabin lights illuminating the darkness outside, I finally relaxed, knowing that the woods had lost their hold on me. I would cherish this moment, and I would never forget the lessons learned in those shadowy trees. I decided to take a weekend trip to a cabin in the woods. It was a little getaway I had planned for months. I wanted to escape the noise of the city and enjoy some peace. The cabin was small, surrounded by tall trees, and it felt like the perfect place to relax. When I arrived, the sun was shining, and everything seemed calm. I unpacked my things, lit a fire in the fireplace, and settled into the cozy living room. The wooden walls and the smell of pine made the cabin feel warm and inviting. After making some lunch, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was beautiful. The trees were tall, and the sunlight peeked through the leaves. I walked for a while, enjoying the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. After a few hours, I returned to the cabin, feeling tired but happy. I lit the fireplace again and sat down with a book. As evening fell, the forest outside grew darker. I noticed how quiet it became, with only the crackling of the fire breaking the silence. I felt a little uneasy, but I shrugged it off. I was alone in the woods, after all. I locked the doors and pulled the curtains tight, wanting to keep the darkness outside. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a noise outside. It was faint, like something moving through the brush. I paused, listening carefully. The sound stopped, and I shook my head, telling myself it was probably just an animal. I climbed into bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I lay there, the noise returned, louder this time. It sounded like footsteps crunching on the leaves. My heart raced. I had no signal on my phone, and the cabin felt isolated. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly got out of bed. I felt foolish but also scared. I wanted to know what was out there. I moved to the window and carefully pulled back the curtain. The beam from my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the area around the cabin. At first, I saw nothing, just trees and shadows. But then, I spotted something moving near the edge of the forest. My breath caught in my throat. It was hard to see, but it looked like a large figure. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal. My mind raced with possibilities. What if it was someone lost? Or worse, what if it was someone dangerous? I felt a chill run down my spine. The figure seemed to hesitate, then moved closer to the cabin. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I quickly turned off the flashlight, feeling the panic rise. I stepped back from the window, thinking about what to do. I considered grabbing my car keys and leaving, but I didn't want to risk being outside alone in the dark. I waited, listening. The sound of footsteps stopped, and an eerie silence filled the air. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to look again. I pulled the curtain back slowly, shining the flashlight outside once more. This time, the figure was gone. I felt a mix of relief and confusion. Where had it gone? I didn't want to linger too long by the window, so I backed away and locked the door, securing it as best I could. I lay back in bed, trying to convince myself I was safe. I focused on the sound of the wind outside, which had picked up, rustling the leaves. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke early the next morning, sunlight spilling into the cabin. I felt much better, but the events of the night still lingered in my mind. I decided to check outside. Maybe it was all just my imagination. Stepping outside, the fresh air hit me, and I took a deep breath. The world looked different in the daylight. I walked around the cabin, checking for signs of anything unusual. As I walked toward the edge of the woods, I noticed something on the ground. It was a backpack, worn and old, partially hidden by leaves. I picked it up, feeling a mix of curiosity and fear. It was clear that someone had been here recently. I unzipped it and found clothes, some empty food wrappers, and a small flashlight. There were no signs of anyone around now, but I felt uneasy, knowing someone had been so close to my cabin. Realizing I wasn't alone in these woods made my heart race again. I took the backpack and walked back to the cabin, my mind racing. I knew I needed to leave. I packed my things quickly, adrenaline fueling my actions. The peaceful weekend I had planned was over. As I drove away from the cabin, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road behind was empty, just trees and the distant sounds of the forest. I felt relieved to be leaving, but shaken by the realization of what could have happened. The woods were beautiful, but they held secrets, and I knew I didn't want to uncover any more of them. I decided that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and sometimes the safety of home is the best kind of adventure. I had been looking forward to this weekend getaway for weeks. A friend canceled last minute, but I decided to go to the cabin alone anyway. It was a small, rustic place in the woods, far from the noise of the city. I thought some time alone in nature would be relaxing. When I arrived, the cabin looked just as I remembered from the photos. The wood was worn, but it had character. I unpacked my things and settled in, feeling the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. The air was crisp and fresh, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and chirping birds. That first evening, I lit a fire and sat outside on the porch. The sun set slowly, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. I felt peaceful, but as night fell, the forest transformed. The sounds of nature grew louder, and the darkness felt thicker. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping in. After a while, I went inside and closed the door. I turned on a few lights, and the cabin felt warm and cozy again. I made some dinner and settled down on the couch, flipping through a book, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. The shadows outside danced in the flickering light, and I felt like something was watching me. As I read, I heard a noise outside. It was faint, like something rustling in the bushes. I paused, straining to listen. The sound stopped, replaced by a deep silence. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but unease settled in my stomach. I brushed it off and returned to my book. A few hours later, I decided to go to bed. As I lay there, I heard the noise again. This time it was louder, a series of sharp snaps, like branches breaking. My heart raced. I glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal, but my mind wouldn't let it go. I got out of bed and walked to the window, shining my flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. I felt silly for being scared, but a part of me remained on edge. I locked the door and climbed back into bed, trying to dismiss the fear. But then I heard it again. This time it sounded closer, almost right outside the cabin. My heart pounded as I lay still, listening. The snapping continued, accompanied by a low, rustling sound. It was too loud to ignore now, and my pulse quickened. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I felt trapped, unsure of what to do. I decided to grab a flashlight and something to protect myself, just in case. I quietly opened the bedroom door and made my way to the kitchen. I found a heavy frying pan and held it tight in one hand, the flashlight in the other. I stepped carefully to the front door, my breath coming in quick bursts. As I approached, I heard a thud against the wall. I jumped back, my heart racing. It was definitely something out there. I shined the flashlight towards the door, my hands trembling. Suddenly, the noise stopped. I waited, listening hard, but the silence was deafening. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my courage. I turned the doorknob slowly and opened the door a crack, shining the flashlight outside. Nothing, just the porch, empty and quiet. I stepped outside cautiously, the cool air biting at my skin. I scanned the area, the beam of light revealing nothing unusual. I felt foolish for being scared, thinking maybe it was just a raccoon or something similar. But then, I heard a soft whimper, like a dog crying. My heart sank. I followed the sound to the edge of the woods. As I moved closer, I spotted a small dog, muddy and trembling. It looked lost and scared. I knelt down, feeling relieved to see it was just an animal. I approached slowly, holding out my hand. The dog looked up at me with big, fearful eyes. I coaxed it over, and after a moment, it came to me, wagging its tail hesitantly. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I had been so scared, but here was this little creature, just needing help. I took the dog back inside, giving it some water and food I had brought along. I felt a sense of calm return. As I sat on the couch with the dog curled up beside me, I realized that sometimes what we fear most turns out to be something simple, something that needed kindness. As dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the cabin. I watched the little dog sleep peacefully. I knew I wouldn't be alone anymore, and that made me smile. It was a scary night, but it ended with something good, a new friend to share my adventure with.